And now we're going to talk a little bit about his birth location. One of the things that fascinates me about the prophecy of the birth location, just talking about where the guy was born, we can't look at this from the prophet's perspective, from the perspective of the Holy Spirit, without touching on his kingdom and his deity. Let me show you what I mean. In Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, he said, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting." Now this passage is foretelling the birth of the Messiah. That's generally conceded by conservative Jewish scholars, and this has been for centuries regarded by the rabbis as a foretelling of the birth of Christ. And it was certainly understood to be such a foretelling in the first century times, as we'll demonstrate to you momentarily. But observe the prophecies about the town of Bethlehem. And he refers to that town as Ephratah. That's just a more ancient name of this town of Bethlehem. And he says, even though you're a small city compared to others in Judah, something great is going to happen there in you. And what's significant about Bethlehem is it's a city that David's family is from. So we're back into that Davidic line and the Davidic dynasty. He said, "Yeah, out of thee shall he come forth." Now, what's this one that's going to come forth? What's he going to be? Well, the prophet said he would be ruler in Israel. There's his kingdom. That theme that was introduced back in the patriarchal age, talking about the birthplace, he keeps it connected with the core themes that were commenced during the patriarchal age. Now, who is this ruler in Israel, this Messiah? What's his nature? He said, well, his goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. What does it mean that Messiah is from everlasting? Quite frankly, that means he's an eternal being. He's an eternal being. You know, the Jehovah's Witnesses say that Jesus was created, and the Jehovah's Witnesses are wrong. They'll turn to Psalms 90 and 2 that says God is from everlasting, and they'll say, see there, the Father is eternal because He's from everlasting. We have the exact same phrase in the Hebrew here that says the Messiah is from everlasting. The Son of God, Jesus, the Messiah, is just as eternal as God. And we learn this, of all things, in a place telling us where He would be born into the world. So the Messiah King in Psalms 45 is rightly said, "Thy throne, O God," because He truly is God. He's from everlasting. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 4 through 6, the chief priests are getting together, and they're talking about, now, where's this going to happen? And when He had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, He demanded of them where Christ should be born. They said to Him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it is written by the prophet, Thou Bethlehem of the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel." So, here's Herod wanting to know where Jesus would be born because he felt threatened. Because he knew that the Messiah would be the king. And being a civil ruler himself, he felt threatened. Wrongly so, but he felt threatened. So he goes to the scribes and the chief priests and the experts about the law, and he says, "Where did the prophets say Messiah would be born?" And they said, "Well, he'll be born in Bethlehem." And then they cited Micah 5 and verse 2 in proof of that proposition, that Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. So here's the idea in the first century among the Jews, many of whom were either indifferent about Christ or enemies of Christ later on in His life. And they, oh yeah, Messiah is born in Bethlehem. Everybody knows that. So you see, Micah 5 and 2 has long been understood as a Messianic prophecy. And he said the Messiah is from everlasting. Look in John 7 and verse 42. They're talking about Christ and where He was from. And they said, "Hath not the Scripture said that Christ cometh of the seed of David and out of the town of Bethlehem where David was?" You see now here in their conception of where Messiah was supposed to be born, they connected the birthplace prophecy with the Davidic promise. They said Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. Why? Because that's the city of David, and that's where David's family was from. If He's born in the family of David, it only stands to reason that He would be born in David's hometown of Bethlehem. So, therefore, they believed that Messiah would come from Bethlehem. And they saw this seed of David connected to the Micah 5 and verse 2 prophecy. So let's go back into Micah and let's get some context. And let's see if there's anything in the context that really justifies this messianic theme that we attach to it. There's a war in Zion at the end of Micah 4. We can take this up at verse 11. He said, now also many nations are gathered against thee, that say, let her be defiled, and let our eye look upon Zion. But they know not the thoughts of the Lord, neither understand they his counsel. For he shall gather them as the sheaves into the floor, and arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion. For I will make thine horn iron, and I will make thy hoofs brass, and thou shalt beat in pieces many people. And I will consecrate their grain unto the Lord, and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth. What's going on here? Well, the enemies of God, Satan's seed, are in a battle against God's people, the followers of God. Do you remember where it was first foretold that ongoing war would happen? That's right, Genesis 3 in verse 15, foretold that there would be this ongoing epic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, the war between the followers of Satan and the followers of God, the progeny of God following her seed, the divine Messiah, and the followers of Satan, what the New Testament calls the children of disobedience. And they, being locked in this battle, God's people would enjoy God's divine aid in the saving of our souls and the rescuing us from this sin-sick world. And so here he describes nations being gathered against Zion's God, the Israel of God, the followers of God. And the followers of God are promised victory here. He said, you're going to beat these enemy forces into pieces. And you might look at that and you might say, well, now Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, and you'd be right. And you might think that would have something to do with Judah's struggle to survive the onslaught of the Assyrians as they overtook every other nation around them. And it may in some way look to that in a shadowy sense. But the rabbis have always said this context is really about Messiah, and they're right. Because all this promise of beating the enemies of God's people into pulp and all that sort of thing, these things are more realized spiritually. Judah remained independent of Syria, but they didn't go to Nineveh and whip all their armies and overthrow the Assyrian Empire. See, none of that to the degree that it's described here happened in those contemporary events. And we learned in last night's study as a principle that when the contemporary events just keep on not fitting quite so well, that this might be a shadow of something yet future, and in this case, something messianic. Look at Micah 5 in verse 1 now. He said, now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. I wonder when that happened. The judge of Israel, you know, he that's to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Yeah, that judge, he's going to be smitten on the cheek with a rod. When? Maybe it be when he was chastised with stripes and with a rod for the sins of mankind. Maybe that's a hint of the crucifixion there in Micah chapter 5 and verse 1 as we're continuing to read here through this same context. And then from that, the child is born, Micah 5 and 2, which we read a moment ago about him being born, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Look in Isaiah 9 and verse 6 and see how well this harmonizes. The child born. Unto us a child is born, and a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Now look at it. See how well Isaiah 9 and 6 and Micah 5 and 2 lay alongside one another, side by side, saying the same thing in different words. As Isaiah is involved in a discussion of Christ being born of a virgin, and Micah is involved in a discussion of where Christ would be born, they both wind up crisscrossing and discussing the same details because they're dealing with the same messianic themes that began to be told all the way back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. Look at it. We've got the birth of a child. Look at what else we have. He's the ruler. The government shall be upon his shoulders. He'll be a ruler in Israel. Look at what else we have. His goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. He's the everlasting Father. He's the eternal Son of God. Some suggest that phrase, everlasting Father, could aptly be translated Father of eternity. And that might be a proper way to understand that particular passage. Let's move along now. Look at the birthplace idea of Bethlehem Ephratah that we talked about. Now let's go back to Matthew 2 and verse 1. It says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Now verse 4, when they had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. They said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. We studied this, but I wanted to look at it again just so you could see that Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem of Judea, just as Micah 5 and verse 2 foretold. So we see Jesus fulfilling this expectation of the Messianic prophecy. Now look at John chapter 7, verse 41 and 42. Others said, this is the Christ. But some said, shall Christ come out of Galilee? Hath not the Scripture said that Christ come out of the seed of David, out of the seed of Bethlehem, where David was? They're trying to figure out whether or not Jesus is the Christ, and some of them didn't understand Jesus' roots. You see, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, remember he had to escape the massacre, and that's something we'll study, Lord willing, momentarily. And he escaped down to the land of Egypt and was later called up out of Egypt. We talked about that last night, didn't we? And we'll revisit that briefly this morning. So he comes from Bethlehem, where he's born, down to Egypt. Then he's later called up out of Egypt, and his folks go up and live in Nazareth, near Galilee. So later on in his life, he was perceived as being from the area of Galilee. And so as the Jews of his day are saying, is this the Messiah? Some of them say he can't be. He's from Galilee. You remember that one guy early in John's Gospel? Can anything good come from Nazareth? Let me tell you, that in the Jews' thinking of the first century, nothing good come out of Nazareth or Galilee. Their Messiah was to come from Bethlehem. What they didn't understand is that's precisely where Jesus came from. But Christ not only had to come from Bethlehem, there's a part of his ministry that had to touch Galilee of the nations. And I'll show you, Lord willing, in our study in a little while, why that's the case. Look at the mother that's foretold there. Let me ask you, you see a virgin birth in Micah chapter 5? I showed you, Jeremiah 31 and 22 earlier. God's going to create something. A woman shall encompass a man. Now, if God creates it and a woman encompasses, would that sound like a miraculous conception to you? Well, we studied Isaiah 7 and verse 14, and I referenced you the charts there in our previous lesson that deal with all that. So we got the virgin birth there in Isaiah 7. What about in Micah? Is there anything about a virgin there? Well, let's look carefully and see what we can find. We've got the one born whose goings forth have been from old, from of everlasting. Now, what about verse 3? Therefore will he give them up until the time that she which travaileth hath brought forth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. All right. Someone's going to be born whose goings forth have been from everlasting, and she which travaileth will bring him forth. If you've got a pregnant woman bearing a divine child, is there any implication in that was all brought about by a miracle? Or do you think a divine child has a natural sire? Which would you think more logical? Now, I know Micah 5 is not coming right out and saying that the Messiah was born of a virgin, but I believe it's implied here. And what's interesting to me is when you compare that with Isaiah 7 and 14, you've got the same thing. A virgin shall conceive, bring forth a son, and call his name Emmanuel. She which travaileth will conceive and bring forth a son, and his goings have been from everlasting. It's the same story about the same woman bearing the same child. Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries. Isaiah foretold of a mother who would bear a divine child, and Micah foretold of a mother who would bear a divine child. You see the similarity between the two prophecies. This virgin birth issue belongs to Christianity. This is the truth. This is the truth, and it's demonstrated over and over in these different passages that we look at. Now let's look at the peace that he's said to bring. In Micah 5, verse 4 and 5, continuing now to talk about this child that's born, it says, he shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide, for now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. Is that universal in scope? Does his greatness far-reaching, is it far-reaching throughout the ends of the earth? Is the nature of his work something that's universal? I think you can see that in Micah 5 and verse 4. Now look at verse 5. And this man shall be the peace, when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. Now, if you're wondering about the 7 shepherds and 8 principal men, there's some number play going on there, and I suspect that's just a figurative way of saying he's going to do the ultimate job against the enemy of God's people. Now, is it about the war with the Assyrians? Well, when Judah defeated the Assyrians, did their reign embrace the ends of the earth? No. Was it a man that brought eternal peace? No, Hezekiah lived in a time of war, and those that followed, there was even more war that followed. None of this was literally fulfilled in the time of Hezekiah or in the contemporary time of the years that followed Micah. So it has to be looking to something bigger and something better, something eternal, something that brought about peace for those who are locked in the throes of this time-bound battle that's foretold in Genesis 3 and verse 15. Peace, ultimately, with God. That's the peace that Messiah brings, where man who was cast out of the garden finds his way back to being at one with God. Assyria here that you see in verse 5, the Assyrian, he represents the enemy of God's people. And you might look at that and say, how can a foreign nation and a foreign king represent Satan? Because that's what I'm really saying. Well, I don't know. Ask Ezekiel. He used the king of Tyre to represent Satan over, what is it, Ezekiel chapter 28? Why should we be surprised when some other nation and the things that they did against God's people is used as a symbol of Satan and his attacks against God's people? Because after all, isn't that ultimately who's behind the attempt to shut down the house of David and shut down the promise of God? Isn't that really what it's about, this ongoing battle between good and evil? You might look at Isaiah chapter 13 and see the king of Babylon there. And you might think of him as a comparison to Satan. Many people see Isaiah 13 in just such a way. It's not at all uncommon for these enemy kings and enemy nations to typify or foreshadow the work of Satan in fighting against God's people, and see how he's defeated. And how Christ is the ultimate shepherd and the ultimate prince. 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And see how he brings peace in Romans 5 and verse 1. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's a little bit about Christ being born in Bethlehem. And when you look at the circumstances around that prophecy, it's very clear that it is indeed a messianic prophecy of his messianic work. Now let's look at the prophecy of the gifts being brought to the baby Jesus. In Psalms chapter 72, verse 9 and 10, he said, they that dwell in the wilderness shall bow before him, and his enemies shall lick the dust, and the kings of Tarshish and the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. Going to verse 15, and he shall live, and to him shall be given the gold of Sheba. Prayer also shall be made for him continually, and daily shall he be praised. So here we have a prophecy of the circumstances regarding Christ's birth, wherein, at these circumstances, someone is bringing gifts to him. Now, the bringing of these gifts is, of course, fulfilled in the New Testament discussion of Christ's birth, and I want to make sure I've got a page reference for you here, because we're going to look at a chart in just a moment on page 165, and I want you to have that for when we go into that discussion. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2 and read the first 2 verses and also verse 11. He said, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born, King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. Now look back at Psalms chapter 72 and see people bowing before him. See them bringing gifts. See them recognizing him as the King of Israel. It said in verse 11, when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented to him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Here you see him brought gifts of gold and so forth, such as is discussed in the prophecy in Psalms chapter 72. Now someone might step in and say, oh no, Psalm 72 is about Solomon, you see, in his reign. That's what some would say. It's not about the Messiah. That's about Solomon and the different kings and so forth, and the Queen of Sheba and like that, bringing him gifts. Well, let's see if it's about Solomon. Go back to Psalm 72, as you see on the chart there, in verse 5 and verse 7 says, they shall fear before thee as long as the sun and moon endure. Look at verse 7, so long as the moon endureth. That's how long he's going to reign. How long did Solomon reign? The sun and the moon are still there, but Solomon's long gone. He didn't reign eternally. This isn't about Solomon. He didn't reign eternally. It might be about Solomon in as much as he foreshadowed Christ, but this is about something greater than Solomon. It has to be. Look at verse 8. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth. Someone might say, well, that's just there from the Sea of Galilee down to the, or not the Sea of Galilee, but rather from the Mediterranean Sea down to the Red Sea, like that. Oh no, he says it reaches to the ends of the earth. Did Solomon's territory reach to the ends of the earth? Any great description of Solomon's territory, now, no matter how much you might exaggerate your interpretation of the description, none of those would bring us to a conclusion that Solomon reigned to the ends of the earth. Solomon did not do that. This has to be about someone greater than Solomon. It might use Solomon as a foreshadowing picture or a type of Christ, but in reality, this is about Messiah's eternal rule, enduring forever. This is about Messiah's boundless kingdom that reaches even to the ends of the earth, a blessing to all nations. This is about the Abrahamic promise. God blessing all nations through the work of the Messiah. Psalm 72 and verse 17, His name shall endure forever. His name shall be continued as long as the sun, and men shall be blessed in Him. All nations shall call Him blessed. Solomon was not a blessing to all nations, but Messiah is. The subject of the Abrahamic promise is, you would have to be blinded by arrogance to look at this and think that was Solomon. It can't be Solomon. As great as he was, he did nothing like this. The prophetic context of the discussion of bringing gifts to the king is not about the gifts that were brought to he who in comparison to the Messiah was a paltry King Solomon. No, it's about King Messiah and the universal scope of his kingdom and the universal nature of his reign. Now what about the massacre that happened at the time of his birth? Let's go back to Jeremiah 31 and look at verse 15. From the New King James, it says, Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Here we have the familiar passage that discusses the massacre of the innocents. And there are some charts from page 166 to the pages that follow that will discuss all of this. And some of this is kind of important, so I want to draw your attention to some things that we have on the board going all the way up through page 172. There are some things that are noted about the historical truth of this particular event, because there are some people who say the massacre of the innocents never happened. You might say, what do you mean massacre of the innocents? Well, this is a prophecy that at the time of Messiah's birth, many babies would be killed. And Rachel here, representing the mothers of Israel, would weep for their children because they were no more, because they had been killed. Now, remember when Herod was looking for Messiah and he went to the chief priest, said, where's Messiah supposed to be born? They said, Bethlehem. So he asked the wise men, where's Messiah? They wouldn't tell him. And so he says, fine, I'll kill all the babies in Bethlehem. We're going to get him one way or the other. That's what this passage is about. Look in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 through 18. He sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Now, a typical modern Jewish interpreter would look at this, and number one, he's likely to say, the massacre of the innocents never happened. Josephus never talked about it, the Jewish historian, and since Josephus never talked about it, it must not have happened. Because surely anything as notorious as going into a village and slaughtering all the baby boys, surely anything that awful would be talked about by a Jewish historian such as Josephus. And since he didn't mention it, it obviously didn't happen. Number two, he would say, that's not what Jeremiah 31 and 15 is about. It's not foretelling the birth of the Messiah and the circumstances associated with that birth. It's talking about the mothers of Israel back in that day, the Jewish mothers whose children have been carried away captive to the land of Babylon. And here they are weeping. Some of them have been carried away captives. Some have been killed in the wars, or as in Babylon invaded Jerusalem and invaded Judah and destroyed the cities and whatnot. So that's not even about that. Well, let's study the context and see. Number one, let's observe that this is consistent with what we learned about Hosea 11 in verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Matthew 2:15 says that after Herod, who perpetrated this massacre, died, then Christ was called up out of Egypt. So what we're looking at here with Jeremiah 31 and 15 rests on the truth of a prophecy we studied last night. And we show that Hosea 11:1 is indeed about the Messiah being called out of Egypt. So you've got one passage says he's got to be born in Bethlehem. Now you've got another one that says he's got to be called out of Egypt. And there's yet another one that indicates that his ministerial work would begin in Galilee or in that region of the northern kingdom. Well, how can he be from all three places? With God, that's not a problem. We'll get him born in Bethlehem. Then Satan's ongoing attempt to thwart the Messianic work, he'll escape that and go down to Egypt. Then we'll call him out of Egypt and bring him up to the northern part of the nation of Israel. And that'll satisfy all three of these prophetic demands. So, we got to be careful before we jump to the conclusion that Jeremiah 31 is not a prophecy of the Messiah. There are other prophecies that tie in with the big picture that give us a reason to believe that maybe this is about the Messiah. Now let's get the setting. Let's back up into Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 9 and verse 18. He said, "They shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them." That's verse 9. Verse 18, "Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents, and have mercy on his dwelling places, and the city shall be builded up upon her own heap, and the palaces shall remain after the manner thereof." Okay. This is talking about the establishment of David, their king. And this is, remember, that familiar Messianic type. This is like Ezekiel chapter 34. This is like Ezekiel chapter 37. We have Jeremiah doing the same thing Ezekiel, his contemporary, did. He's naming David, but he's talking about the Messiah. Because David, in Jewish theology, is a type of Christ. He foreshadowed the coming Messiah because Messiah was to come from the house of David. I mentioned earlier in an earlier study, Joseph Klausner, as well as other Jewish interpreters, look at passages like Jeremiah 30 and verse 9 and say, don't you see, the language isn't literal. It isn't literally about King David. It's about Messiah. It's naming him David just because David typifies him or foreshadows him. So this is well known to be a prophecy of the Messianic age. A premillennialist would look at this, or at Ezekiel 34, or at Ezekiel 37, where he names the Messiah David and say, don't you see, that's not literal. He's naming the Messiah David because David typified him. So some of these people that want to really twist and plead for a literal interpretation of some of these prophecies, they'll fall off of that in a New York minute. When you get to a passage like Jeremiah 30 and verse 9, then all of a sudden we can figurize, symbolize, typify, and shadowize, and everything else that we have to do, see, to make it make sense. Because we can look at that and we can see, hey, you know what? That's a prophecy of the Messiah. Because look at what he's doing in verse 18. I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents. This has one of those familiar Messianic themes. So many passages in the Old Testament that foretell the coming of the Messiah talk about him gathering Israel, gathering God's people. Here he's bringing again the captivity of Jacob's tents. So think about that gathering of God's people. Now look in Jeremiah 31 and verse 1. At the same time, saith the Lord, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Well, that's familiar New Covenant language there, isn't it? And that's a Messianic theme that's brought up in many, many Messianic prophecies. So there's no doubt that Jeremiah 30 and Jeremiah 31 have the language of the Messianic age. They're foretelling Messianic events. You might recall Jeremiah 31 even foretells the coming of the New Covenant. And that shouldn't surprise us because, after all, isn't the rightful owner of the scepter supposed to be a lawgiver? Yes, he is. Isn't he supposed to bring a law as per what we learned regarding the comparison between Moses and Christ there in Deuteronomy chapter 18? All this being messianic, when we look at it that way, it's in harmony with the context, and it's also in complete harmony with this river of messianic thought that runs throughout the Old Testament. We're being quite fair with Jeremiah 31 and the larger context of Old Testament teaching when we see that as messianic. Now, continuing Jeremiah 31, verse 2 through 14. Thus saith the Lord, the people which were left of the sword found grace in the wilderness, even Israel, when I went to cause him to rest. The Lord hath appeared of old unto me, saying, Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Again I will build thee. Here's that restoration, gathering of the remnant theme. And thou shalt be built, O virgin of Israel. Thou shalt again be adorned with thy tabrets. Thou shalt go forth in the dances of them that make merry. Thou shalt yet plant vines upon the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant and shall eat them as common things. For there shall be a day that the watchman upon the mount of Ephraim shall cry, Arise ye, and let us go up to Zion unto the Lord our God. Here we have this symbolic language of crops being planting and the prosperity of the crops growing there, and how that's all about the regathering of Israel into this Zion of God. And the premillennialists would look at that and say, oh, well, we've got the Messianic age, we've got the 1,000-year reign and the abundant crops and so forth like that. You know, Amos 9 has a prophecy about abundant crops, and when the Apostle James took it up in Acts 15, he said it was about the church. I'll tell you, this is about the Messianic work, the Messianic spiritual work of restoring people into the Israel of God, Jews and Gentiles being gathered in the Messiah's spiritual kingdom, the church. Reading on now in verse 7, he said, For thus saith the Lord, Sing with the gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Publish ye, praise ye, and say, O Lord, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. He's bringing salvation. This reeks of Messiah's spiritual mission to bring salvation. He said, Behold, I'll bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, the regathering of Israel. And with them the blind and the lame and the woman with child and her that travaileth with child together. A great company shall return thither, and they shall come with weeping, and with supplications will I lead them. I will cause them to walk by the rivers of water in a straight way, wherein they shall not stumble. For I am the father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He that scattered Israel will gather him, and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. For the Lord hath redeemed Jacob, and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. Therefore they shall come and sing in the height of Zion. This is about the spiritual gathering of God's people into the Zion of God. And shall flow together to the goodness of the Lord for wheat, and for wine, and for oil, and for the young of the flock, and of the herd of their soul shall be watered as a garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. Then shall the virgin rejoice and dance, both young men and old together, for I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them, and make them rejoice from their sorrow. And I will satiate the soul of the priest with fatness, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord. Is this about a restoration? Is this about a remnant being rebuilt, refurbished, reestablished? Is this about a time of rejoicing and celebration? Then why are the mothers of Israel crying? This isn't about mothers of Israel back then crying because their kids had left to Babylon. Oh, it may see that in shadow. But there are a set of mothers that are crying at a time when someone was being brought in who would reunify and revitalize God's people, the Messiah. At the time of his birth, mothers would be crying. Now, all this restoration theme and remnant theme, look at the similar theme brought up in Isaiah 11, also universally understood as a messianic passage. It says, It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And you look at that, and so many people say, oh, that's this millennial kingdom. That's this great future messianic age. Isaiah chapter 11 is a context that quoted in the New Testament is being fulfilled in the church. If you look at the very end of your notes, there's some material past the section at the end of sermon number 10 that breaks down Isaiah chapter 11 and shows how every point of that passage is fulfilled and realized in Christ's spiritual mission through the church. But what about this weeping? Lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. How does that fit in the time of rejoicing? Because the event that made the rejoicing possible, the birth of Christ, was accompanied by mothers grieving for the loss of their children. Mothers weeping for their children gone in the exile foreshadow mothers weeping for their babies who perished in the massacre. Now, someone says, yeah, but that never really happened. Josephus does not mention this. However, Matthew does. We not only look at Matthew as a Christian writer, but we look at Matthew as a historian. Now, if we're going to discount it just because Matthew was a Christian, then why wouldn't we discount Josephus leaving it out because he's a Jew? Why is it that just because someone was a Christian writer, we have to brand him as a liar and say, oh, well, it never happened? Where's the evidence that says that it never happened? Furthermore, Ambrosius Theodosius Macrobius, a Roman philosopher of the 4th century, mentioned the massacre of the innocents. Although in his story some of the details varied, he still mentions it as a historical fact. Not only that, Irenaeus mentioned it 2 centuries earlier than this Roman philosopher. In his work, Irenaeus Against Heresies, book 3, paragraph 16, chapter 3, paragraph 16, section 4, there about the same time, Tertullian mentioned it in his work on the flesh of Christ. Both of these guys, not too long after the 1st century, mentioned the massacre of innocents that's recorded by Matthew. Someone says, well, yeah, but they're Christian. And I say, does that mean they're liars? Where's the record that says Matthew wrote fiction? Where's the historical record that says these other guys didn't tell the truth? What? Because Josephus didn't mention it, we're going to put more weight on that than we are 4 other guys who did, one of which wasn't even a Christian. I believe there's abundant historical evidence that says the massacre of the innocents did happen just as was prophesied in Jeremiah 31. And we've shown from the context of Jeremiah 31, a context the rabbis consistently apply to Messianic times. We've shown from that context that it fits the birth of Christ and fits it quite well. All right, now, what about the time frame of this massacre? This is going to deal with a time chart that I want you to be able to glance at. You'll see this on page 174 of your notes as we read from Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. He said, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, to build Jerusalem, unto Messiah Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, the wall even in troubled times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading of the abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. You might look at that and say, well, there's a lot there I don't understand. Don't worry about it. Because all we need in order to get our point from this particular passage is just to understand a few critical things from this context. Notice he said 70 weeks are determined upon the people. The word that's translated week means heptad. That's a cluster of 7. That word in the Hebrew Bible does not always mean a week like Sunday through Saturday week. Sometimes it just means a cluster of 7. You could have a heptad of fruit. It's a fruit basket, 7 pieces of fruit. You could have a heptad of anything. You could have a heptad of years. In the context of Daniel chapter 9, Daniel the prophet was grieving over the city of Jerusalem and praying to God in earnest about the city of Jerusalem because he'd been contemplating Jeremiah's prophecy that Jerusalem and the Jews would be carried away captive in the land of Babylon for 70 years. 70 years. 70 years. And as Daniel thought about these 70 years and in earnest prayed and wept over Jerusalem, praying and begging that God would restore Jerusalem for His name's sake, thinking of the 70 years it had been in ruin, 70 years, God come along and said 77s. Does that sound like 70 heptads of years to you? That's what it sounds like to me. 70 clusters of 7. 7 what? What had he been thinking about? He'd been thinking about the 70-year captivity. And God's going to take it out to 77s of years, or 490 years. And this is a thing that would involve, look at this, making an end of sins. Is there something there about the mission of Messiah in Genesis 3:15 to take away the work of Satan, sin, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring us back into union with God from whence sin had separated us? Does it involve the anointing of the Most Holy, that is, the Messiah? Well, when does this 490 years start? From the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem. And this is the one that involves the street and the wall being rebuilt. From the time that that command was issued forward, you're going to count 62 sevens or heptads of years and 7 sevens. In other words, I believe that works out to 483 years. And up to that time, what's going to happen? Here comes Messiah the Prince. So we're going to go 7 weeks and 62 weeks and add that time all together from the beginning of that command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, the temple, and all like that up till Messiah's ministry. That would be that period of time. And then what's going to happen after that 62 or 69 week mark? Well, one thing that's going to happen is Messiah is going to be cut off. He's going to be killed. What? Messiah killed? I thought he abides forever. O fools, slow of heart to believe all the prophets have said, ought not Christ to have suffered, then to have entered into his glory? Remember our Messianic theme that started in Genesis 3:15? When we look at this passage through the lens of Genesis 3:15, it makes much more sense. Messiah is going to be killed. Why? To make an end of sins and make reconciliation for iniquity. That's the divine aid in human form. But what else is going to happen after that 69-week period? All the people are going to come and destroy Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy the sanctuary or the temple. Now let's chart it. That command that he's talking about, that in 457 we find a king making a command on the authority of which the temple reconstruction was completed, as well as this work of the city of Jerusalem, the walls and the streets and all that. Then you go forward 49 years or 7 sevens and another 434 years or 62 sevens. That brings you up to the time of the Messiah the Prince. If you count forward that many years from 457 to 26 A.D., that's the number that you come to. From 457, you count this many years forward, you come up to 26 A.D., which happens to be the year that Jesus began his personal ministry. So from the time of that command till the beginning of Christ's personal ministry, that time works out perfectly. Now something's going to happen after this point in time, after that 62 weeks of years. The Messiah is going to be cut off. What else is going to happen? The people of the prince will come and destroy the city and the temple. That is very significant because that says something about the time when Messiah would come. Now I want to ask you to notice this very carefully. However you work out a lot of the details of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, we could talk about that for quite a while, but we're not going to because that's not what we're studying right now. We don't need to unravel all that. Here's one simple thought we've got to understand from Daniel 9. Please listen carefully. Messiah must come before Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 70 A.D. Amen. That is so simple. I'm going to tell you something this afternoon. And I believe this to the core of my soul. If Jesus isn't the Messiah, somebody prior to 70 A.D. was. It had to be. Because Daniel chapter 9, God foretold through the prophet Daniel that the Messiah the Prince would come and Messiah would be cut off, and that would all come prior to the people of the Prince coming and destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple. The city was destroyed. It remains trodden underfoot of the Gentiles to this very day. The temple was destroyed. It's still in ruin to this very day. Where's the Messiah? If it's not Jesus, who is he? Oh, but we're not done. Malachi 3 and verse 1, one of the well-known forerunner prophecies says, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, says the Lord of hosts. Let me see if I can get this all tied together. There's so much in here that ties back to what we've studied already. All right, number one, we've got the messenger coming to prepare the way for the Lord. Universally understood to be the forerunner of Christ. We know that as John the Baptist. But as far as from the prophetic perspective, there's supposed to be someone coming who's the voice crying in the wilderness who would prepare the way for Christ. Now, what's going to happen after he comes and prepares the way before me? Before who? Before me. Who? The Lord. The divine Son of God. Then what happens? That person, the Lord, for whom the way is being prepared, he is going to suddenly come to his temple. He can't come to the temple if it ain't there. That temple had to be standing for the Messiah to visit the temple. See, we see the forerunner prophecy in Malachi chapter 3 harmonizes with our understanding of Daniel chapter 9. And that is the Messiah had to come before 70 A.D., before that temple was destroyed. He had to. Because not only did Daniel say it would be so, Malachi said it would be so. And you go back to read the Jewish discussion of the ministry of Christ and contemporary events, and they'll tell you that all happened before the destruction of the second temple. There's no question. Messiah's coming had to fit in that particular frame of time. You know, in Matthew 11 and verse 10 of John the Baptist, he said, "This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face." And he took that and quoted Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1 and applied that to the ministry of John. Jesus is the only one in all this different picture that we're talking about that fits the time frame of when Messiah would have to be born into the world. It would have to come before the destruction of that second temple. So what have we seen thus far in our studies? We've seen Messiah's suffering and resurrection foretold. For example, in the birth prophecy of Daniel 9, now I know it doesn't specifically mention birth per se, but it gives the timing of when his birth would have to have been. And we talked about that just now. So, in that same prophecy, it says Messiah would be cut off. That's Messiah's death. So one of these prophecies that mentions his birth also mentions his death. We read in Micah chapter 4 and chapter 5 that the judge would be smote on the cheek. I've wondered if that isn't about Messiah's suffering there, but we certainly have it in Daniel chapter 9. We've got the divine incarnation seen in prophecies like Micah 5 and verse 2 and how that ties in with Isaiah 9 and verse 6. You can go back to page 9 of your notes and you can see the Genesis 3 laid out and the Genesis 9 laid out in the patriarchal age, showing Messiah's suffering and resurrection and showing that Messiah would be a divine incarnation, God coming in the form of flesh, and we see that reverberated in these prophecies about Christ's birth that we've studied. The universal nature of Messiah's work that was foretold in the Abrahamic promise, of which you can read, I believe, on page 26 of your notes. That is discussed in Psalm 72, and we found language there that was very deliberately reminiscent of the Abrahamic promise. Messiah's kingdom, that's also foretold in Micah chapter 5, for the one that was born there would be ruler in Israel. Messiah as a miracle worker and a lawgiver, well, we found him born of a virgin, miraculously escaping the massacre of the innocents there, going down to Egypt and all that sort of thing, the miraculous circumstances involved around his birth, and also the anticipation of his kingship. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, the context of Jeremiah chapter 31, and all that about Messiah being king in the Messianic age and him bringing in the new covenant. And remember, when the messenger of the covenant would come there in Malachi chapter 3, who is the messenger? Well, that's Jesus the Messiah. And what is that covenant? Well, Genesis 49 said that the Messiah was to be a lawgiver. We studied that during the patriarchal age, didn't we? He's to be a lawgiver. He's to bring a new covenant. Jeremiah foretold it. Malachi 3 hinted at it. All these tie together. All of these, anytime they mention a birthplace, a virgin mother, the circumstances of the women grieving, the bringing in of the new covenant, the forerunner, they're all bringing up different details, and yet within these different details there are attached other details that are found in other prophecies, that are found in other prophecies, that's got other details found in other prophecies. And they keep tying together and keep tying together, weaving a fabric of messianic thought that cannot be torn and cannot be broken. This river, this stream of messianic thought that flows throughout the ages of time as revealed in Scripture is swelling and swelling. We've seen the introduction of the 5-point core theme in the patriarchal age, commencing with the prophetic headwaters of Genesis 3 and verse 15. And we've seen in the following years that men like Samuel and David in the monarchical period expanded on these earlier themes. And we've studied about some of those expansions earlier in our studies. And now we're looking at the message of the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. And every time we find them adding new detail, as we study the context of that new detail, we find a repetition of these earlier 5 themes. And the picture just keeps getting clearer and clearer, and the waters are rising higher and higher, and they're rushing mightier and more mighty, sweeping us up into our faith that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, an eternal supply of living water from which we might drink and be saved. With that, I leave you with this, I believe, our 6th study in this series. And we're going to break now and sing a song. I'll turn the service over to the song leader, and we'll resume our study shortly.